Well, thank you once again for coming this evening, everybody, to Indigenous participation in the First World War. I'd like to introduce Des Crump and Mark Power from State Library of Queensland, who are going to take you through this workshop. So thank you, Des. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Amanda. And thanks very much. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of land, the Yagara and Turrbal people of Brisbane, and also acknowledge that this was a shared space, it was a meeting place, and we continue that tradition today. Quick introduction, I'm from southwest Queensland, top end of Gamilaroi Nation. My role here at the State Library is actually Indigenous languages, but with the ANZAC centenary in 2015, they realised that there was quite a lot of interest coming up in the forums and so on about the Aboriginal soldiers. It also coincided with the Black Diggers play, and so because of that interest, they put me on one day a week to research as part of the ANZAC 100 project. Do you want to introduce yourself too?
My name's Mark, and I work with the ANZAC 100 team. I started here in 2014, at the beginning of the war, and at first it was going to be just for 12 months, and then another 12 months, and we're still here for a little while anyway. But as Des said, we've started this project based on requests from people, and one of the biggest requests we had was from the Ration Shed Museum up in Cherbourg. And they were doing their own exhibition from the Boys of Bramber, which they've produced a publication and a website. And at that time we had just started doing these soldier portraits, digitising them, and it's grown from there. But Des will give us a little bit more history of the whys and wherefores of enlistment and that sort of thing. And then we'll go into how we can write a story about someone that we think is Indigenous and where we source that information from, and how we've come to be told that that person is Indigenous, because it's not obvious on records, and the faces here don't have signs on them saying I'm an Indigenous person, just a face with a name often spelt wrong.
So it's meant to be interactive, so certainly if you've got questions or comments or responses to anything along the way, please say. You'll also have a copy of the presentations on the memory stick there, so don't feel obliged to write everything down. Have an education background and haven't been out of the classroom that long that I know that as soon as there's something up on the board, students automatically start writing it down because they think there's going to be a test. It is a labour of love, as Marg has already pointed out. It's not that easy researching Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander soldiers. It's a bit like most Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander family history as well. There's all these sort of hidden gems that you do come across, but a lot of the time it's very much trial and error and hit and miss, and then trying to, I guess, triangulate 2 or 3 different sources to confirm someone's identity. Like I said, around some of you might recognise this image from Black Diggers, the play. Around that time when they started the research around the production and the scripting and so on, because all those stories in that play are actually based on some of the stories that you'll hear today. Oh, sorry, I didn't realise it was going through on auto.
Just space bar, I think. Yep.
At the time, they thought there was probably about 400 to 500 Aboriginal soldiers, Torres Strait Islander soldiers, mostly Aboriginal. We have found 2 of Torres Strait Islander background in the First World War. There may be others, but again, it's that research and checking with other people, because Marg and I, whilst we're here at State Library, there's other people that have been involved in the researching of soldiers for longer than us, and we collaborate with them and share information, and also check our sources and so on. So Black Diggers, when it came out, 400 to 500. Now we're up to the latest edition of the Green Bible, as we like to call it. Philippa Scarlett Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander volunteers for the AOF. She calls them volunteers because not all of them made it through the enlistment process. This one, we're just up to around 1,250 now. But there's probably another 250 we think probably are Aboriginal, but there's not enough information to show us. Sometimes within our collections and other collecting institutions, we'll just have photographs of people. Sometimes there's a name, sometimes there's not. Sometimes there's a bloke like this stuck in the middle, and for those people who do art and photography and all that, immediately your attention is drawn to him because he's carrying a piano accordion. So there's a couple of images from the same doorstep over in the training barracks at Fraser's Paddock, where we've got 2 or 3 where there's an Aboriginal man front and centre of it, and one of them's holding a drum, another one's holding the piano accordion, and so on. So your attention is automatically drawn to them. But this is a time when Aboriginal people weren't allowed to enlist. So we've got some great photos. I'm not used to using these Apple products. We've got a great photo like this, first reinforcements Egypt. There's 7 Aboriginal blokes in there we've got names for, but because we haven't got enough photos or other evidence to cross-match them, we can't match up the names with certainty. And so by putting it out there on blogs and so on, we hope to get the community response where they'll recognise the photo or recognise the image in the photo and hopefully give us some information. Because not all of them are as easy as this bloke to find. William Perrott makes it nice and easy when you've got that magic name Aboriginal behind. This is a war memorial up at Herberton. There's only 2 war memorials in Queensland that we know of that have an Aboriginal name clearly identified. And actually, the other one, this one is at Herberton. The other one is nearby at Evelyn Scrub, where William Perrott worked on the property there at Evelyn Station. So not all of them are as easy as him to find. We've even got a photo of him, but there's the Perrott family at Evelyn Station, but they've got visitors there, and we can't work out with certainty to say, well, we think it probably is William, but we're not completely sure. Because in the experience of war for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it's not a happy one. You've got the Context Protection Act 1897, where all Aboriginal people are classed as being under the guardianship or care of the Queensland Government via the Chief Protector's Office. The Defence Act in 1909 specifically excluded anybody who wasn't Aboriginal, wasn't of significant or substantial European descent. If you saw Black Diggers play, that line gets thrown in there quite a lot. As I said, we're up to about 1,250 volunteers, not all of them enlisted and served. Somewhere around 150 casualties that we know of, 11 medal recipients. Not all of them had a hero's welcome home. If they were returning back to a mission, their medals and all their belongings, their uniform and everything was given to the Chief Protector or the Mission Superintendent, which is why State Library, certainly Australian War Memorial, there's minimal memorabilia around Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander soldiers. In the official history of the First World War, and I'll CEW Bean, there's only one Aboriginal bloke mentioned, and his story was in the Black Diggers as well. Private William Irwin, he was a shearer down near Tamworth on the mission, the Karuna mission. He received the DCM, and if you saw Black Diggers, he won that on the Western Front, like most of the medal recipients in the First World War. His platoon was pinned down by 4 machine guns. He's decided he's going to do something about it. Jumps out of the trench, takes out the first machine gun by himself, picks up some grenades that have fallen from the Germans there, takes out the second. Then he takes out the third. This is all single-handedly. On the way to taking out the fourth, he gets shot. By this stage, one of his comrades in the trenches decided, I better jump up and help him. He gets to William just as he's been shot, picks up the grenade, throws it at the last machine gun nest. That turns the battle. The Allies end up go on to win that battle. The non-Aboriginal bloke who picked up that grenade and took out that fourth machine gun nest, he gets the Victoria Cross. William gets the DCM. And the story doesn't end there, because Private William Irwin, his family back in Corunna, they get the medals and his belongings sent back. 10 years later, 1925, the 10th anniversary of ANZAC in Gallipoli, the mission superintendent decides, I want to borrow those medals so that we can have them as part of the exhibition and the celebration. They haven't been seen since. They're probably sitting in a private collection somewhere, sold through the black market. So there's all those sorts of stories. And it's funny, after one of our blogs, I was contacted by a descendant of William Irwin. And he said, I really love the blog, but how did you know about the medals being stolen or taken away? And I said, I'd heard I was driving somewhere, probably out to Mitchell, I think, Radio National, and here's this story, an interview with one of the other descendants of William Irwin talking about how his great uncle never got his medal. So that's, I guess, one of the rewarding things, making contact or having descendants get in touch with you, because we can only tell so much of the story. The real story needs to be told and shared amongst the family and in that community. We're just sort of, I guess, sowing that seed. Now, just to give you a little bit of a family snapshot, but also to give you an idea of the context of the Protection Act, because you have to remember 1914, when the war's broken out, Aboriginal people under the Protection Act, they're not classed as citizens, they're not allowed to earn an income, their bank accounts and everything are basically managed and controlled by the Queensland government. Every Aboriginal person needed an ID card. So this is my Nana, Nana Hannah. Every Aboriginal person was given a code, an identity number. Then this gives you a good idea of how Aboriginal people viewed at the time. Breed. So when you think of breed, you usually think of livestock, animals and so on. So the three choices back then, and then later on they did add a fourth category. Full blood, half caste, quadroon, which was basically a quarter caste. Sometimes those terms, they're because we're looking at historical materials, they're the terms we need to use in our search to find some of this information about soldiers and so on. So, have people seen an ID card before, by the way? Okay, so one of the great things, and if there is a silver lining to the dark cloud of the protection era, family historians and people like myself who come along later, there's all this information that you're able to access and obtain copies of. So they're given a determination on the breed, the idea being that the more European blood they had in them, that the more civilisable they were and they could fit into society better. They didn't quite go to the extreme as with the American slaves, where they went right down to somebody did a PhD and had this matrix drawn up of 64 by 64 of every possible permutation, combination of whether they're African American, Latin American and so on. And with the Protection Act over here, they only went down to octoroon, 1/8.
Are these available anywhere? Are these ID cards?
Not usually. You have to. These are held within the community personal histories or the state archives, and so family historians like myself can request those. You have to fill out a form to say that how you're connected to that person, and so if you've got children students in your classes wanting to research families, they can make contact with the community personal histories and chase up this sort of information. There's a full-time officer based, Tilly Geary, based out at the Queensland State Archives, and they've also got a research team to help people find information and indexes and so on. So just a couple of other things. Tribal name, if reliable, because as we all know, Aboriginal people aren't very reliable. Protectorate, Gundawindi, so every police district was seen as a protectorate. They were basically there to enforce the government laws and the Protection Act. Year of birth, approximate, because we know if they're a bit unreliable about their tribal name, they're probably just as unreliable about their year of birth. So unfortunately for Nana, she was born on April Fool's Day 1904. They left that part out. She was born at Winton Station, Gundawindi, sheep station, about half an hour out of Gundy, heading west towards Dirranbandi, where her family ended up after shearing. Most of my family, well, certainly from my grandmother's generation, were all born on the property. They probably better off being born there with the Aboriginal midwife and healers to look after them, because if they went to Gundawindi, the hospital there was a place out on the veranda for the Aboriginal births and patients and so on. Parents, so Jimmy Armstrong, Ada Boland, and then name a husband or wife if it's a legal or tribal marriage. So she legally married James Noble in the Presbyterian Church in Gundawindi. And of course, all Aboriginal people look the same, so we need some distinguishing marks or scars, a bit like Australia's Most Wanted when they give you this horrific crime and then they say the person we're looking for has these distinguishing marks and scars. Fortunately, my grandmother didn't have anything. They just made a note to say she's now lawfully married and her name is now Noble. On the back there's a series of blank lines. If my Nana had contact with any government official, police, protector, superintendent or so on, they would make a note on the back there. So Nana kept a fairly clean sheet and didn't have anything written on the back of hers. Any comments about that one? So it gives you an insight into the Protection Act and how restrictive it was. There's 164 sets of laws under the Protection Act, and most of them they're fairly straightforward. You can't marry, you can't earn. The government will take any earnings, bank accounts and so on. And they also had the power to move any Aboriginal person within Queensland, or even outside of Queensland as well. I'll show you in a moment.
Yes, can I ask a, pardon my ignorance sort of question? Where's the card retained? Is it held at the local police station or held with the local post office? Oh no,
my nana had to carry this around with her. They sometimes they'd call them the dog tag. Basically, if you didn't have this piece of paper, if you were stopped by a government official or police, you'd be locked up overnight.
So how do they all end up back at archives
they kept a copy of them back there.
So it's the copy.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because usually they get pretty well sort of dog-eared and yeah. And I've started mentioning some of the Protection Act. I'll just go through this fairly quickly. Aboriginal people could earn less than the minimum wage, so good old Queensland, that was still in place in 1986. Gough Whitlam, when they came in the 70s, they brought in the equal employment and equal wages and all those social justice. Queensland government, under good old Joe Bajelki, said that's not going to happen in Queensland. So for the next 12 years, Aboriginal people in Queensland, particularly if they came under the only state employment laws, they were deliberately underpaid. It wasn't until 1986 when the Attorney General pointed out to Cabinet that it's actually cheaper to pay the Aborigines the same wage than to go through all these court cases that are mounting up at the High Court. So 1986 became the year that all Aboriginal people could earn the same wage in Queensland. Management of income, property, wills, permission to marry, that was still in place in the missions up until the 60s. My mum and dad married in 1955. My dad's non-Aboriginal, my mum's Aboriginal. They needed permission from the government to marry. Compulsory medicals. So there's a whole range of controls for Aboriginal people. That's just a snapshot of them. And they was basically still in effect in Queensland until 1984 when they brought in the Community Council Services Act, which finally repealed the Protection Act. Removal order, probably all seen Rabbit Fence and those. This is what a removal order looks like. I mentioned how under the Act, Aboriginal people could be moved anywhere within the state. You didn't even have to be living in Queensland. This is my great uncle, Uncle Lindsay. So it's got all the usual thing, ID numbers and all that. He's 18, working in New South Wales, living in New South Wales. Comes back up to Queensland in 1937 for his mother's funeral, so my great-grandmother's funeral. Queensland government says you're back under our care and protection now.
Cut that bit.
So he's sent to Cherbourg for his own care and protection. The period of the order is during the minister's pleasure. So basically for as long as the Queensland government decides that he could stay there. So naturally enough, 18, he's used to all this freedom. First chance he gets at Cherbourg, he takes off with Harold Blair, the opera singer, and another gentleman, and they caught them at the back of Lake Broadwater, other side of Dalby. They got as far as there on the way home. Got locked up in the dog box at Cherbourg for a month to teach them a lesson. 1939, so this is 1937. 1939, Second World War breaks out. Uncle Lindsay puts his hand up, he volunteers, goes over to Europe, comes back to Cherbourg, has to stay there. It wasn't until 1960s when they started, in the lead up to the 67 referendum, they started relaxing the restrictions around Aboriginal people on communities, and particularly places like Cherbourg. So Uncle Lindsay finally got to go home 30 years later. But the good thing, if there is a good thing, I'm probably wondering why, restriction of the sale of Opium Act, there were close to 40,000 Chinese people in Queensland at the time. They couldn't bring out a Protection of Chinese Act because they needed controlling. So the mythology around the Queensland government thinking was the Chinese are very wicked people. They're contaminating the Aboriginal people with opium. They need control. So under that Protection Act, when they've added in the sale of opium, 165 laws, 101 applied to the Chinese, the other 64 applied to the Aboriginal people, but most of the Aboriginal ones were very strict. You can't marry, can't do this, can't do that. But you could apply for an exemption. So in 1917, 1st of August, the property owner Donald Cameron out at Welltown Station, he got sick of his Aboriginal workers being taken away because a couple of years before this, my great uncle and great auntie were taken away, going from one property to the next for shearing, didn't have a permit, ended up at Taroom first of all, then over to Warrabinda when that closed, and then Auntie Katie ended up down at Cherbourg and then got sent up to Palm. My grandmother never saw them again. So after that, 1917, Donald Cameron's got the police constable out from Gundawindi, sat all of his workers down at the table, went through one at a time and got exemptions for all of them. So that way, there was 155 Aboriginal people living on Welltown Station at the time. That was the workforce for most of the surrounding properties. So to get that exemption, you needed to pass three things in particular. Know the value of money. So by itself, that piece of paper doesn't look much. I've got the other documentation from the police constable with his notes on there. My grandfather's had to count how much money is on the table, so he's put out pounds, shillings and pence for those people who can remember those. Have we got any people that old, born before 1966? He's had to count that money and say how much was there. And then they had to understand the value of money. So the police constable has said to my grandfather, a loaf of bread costs $1 in a Gundawindi at the bakery. You show me how much money you'd take to that bakery to buy that loaf of bread. So then he's had to count it $1 there. Then he's had to, the next one was they weren't allowed to obtain alcohol or provide alcohol to anyone. And then the third condition, which unfortunately led to a lot of loss of language, loss of culture, if you had an exemption, you couldn't associate with other Aboriginal people unless they also had exemption. So if my grandfather wanted to go to a wedding or a funeral and there was going to be other Aboriginal people there without exemption, he had to get a special permit just for that day to say that he was allowed to associate with those people. So a very, very controlling era. And then on top of that, you've got this Defence Act that says if you're not substantially European origin, you weren't allowed to enlist. So despite all those controls and restrictions, we still had Aboriginal people lining up to volunteer. One of the, I guess, $64,000 question is, why? And some of it's the same reasons as all the other blokes enlisted: loyalty, wanting to serve your country, travel. But for Aboriginal people, the other factors were you've got a wage. Australian War Memorial, Gary Oakley, who is the Indigenous Liaison Officer, one of their forums here, the Defence Force, the Australian Defence Force, was the first equal employer for Aboriginal people. Everybody was just a soldier, everybody got paid the same. The other thing for Aboriginal people was, by leaving the mission, going and serving for the country, the expectation was, oh, we'll be seen as citizens and we'll be treated better. Some of them were, a lot of them weren't. And we'll share some of those as we go through. People aware of the Defence Act 1909? It did get changed later on, because especially with all the heavy losses on the Western Front. It all came down to the opinion of the medical board. Sometimes they might get through the first stage of the enlistment or the volunteering process, and then they might get knocked back by the medical board. Generally, when you got knocked back by the medical board, might be something like flat feet, or and the solution might be to wear some prosthetics or aids in your shoes to fix it up, and then come back in 6 months' time. For most of the Aboriginal people, particularly the ones who've been knocked back, and this is the main way that we find these Aboriginal soldiers, they've been knocked back, because there's nowhere on the form to, like now every form you've got has got tick if you're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. There wasn't anything like that. It usually comes out in the rejection or the opinion of the medical board. So this bloke here, he's not a half-caste, his father's a half-caste, his mother's a full-blood, and he's a very dark and is of Aboriginal type, whatever that is. Sounds like a bit of font. Aboriginal type. I want one of that. I want to install those font on my computer, I think. Whether the disability was active service, or whether it's climate or so on, well, it wasn't caused by any of that. Any specific conditions? No. No disability, does not apply, not substantially of European origin. So basically he's rejected on all accounts there, and there's no remediation that could happen.
Could I just say, it's all purely visual?
Yeah. So, and it really came down to who the enlistment officer was. There was one enlistment officer in South Australia, according to the Australian War Memorial. He didn't enlist any Aboriginal bloke. And so the Aboriginal blokes from the Point Macleay mission worked out that, we don't go to the recruitment office when that bloke is on, we'll go to another one, or we'll wait until somebody else comes in. Yeah. And so it really came down, just how the bloke on the other side of the table saw them, So it meant Aboriginal people would disguise their identity. So we've got Private Richard Martin, 9th Battalion, 1359. He's from Dunwich, over on Stradbroke Island. Fronts up at the recruitment office in Brisbane. Says he's born in Dunedin. Well, starts with the same 3 letters. And not only that, not only is he a Maori, not only is he born in New Zealand, he's a Maori. Under the Treaty of Waitangi, Maoris were allowed to fight or join the British Commonwealth forces. So no questions asked about his identity. He lands at Gallipoli. There's about 57 blokes we've found that were at Gallipoli, Aboriginal blokes. Not any of them are mentioned too much in the war histories or anything either. There's 7, maybe 8 that we know of that are buried there. Richard survives Gallipoli. Dies on the Western Front. Next of kin, his mother, lives down at Southport. The Defence Force personnel turns up with the uniforms and the medals and the other belongings, and an Aboriginal woman answers the door. He's expecting a Maori, so he's had to double check with the Department of Aboriginal Affairs that it was okay for this woman to accept the belongings of her son. So a lot of Aboriginal people would disguise their identity. So even their birthplaces, as we've heard there, so that's the other thing trying to track through and in the research is identifying if the name is correct. Sometimes they'd use a completely different name. They might use the property owner's name. One bloke used the bank manager's name. They would come up with all creative sorts of ways. 1917, after the heavy losses on the Western Front in May, half-caste may now be enlisted in the Australian Imperial Forces, provided that the examining medical officers are satisfied that one of the parents is of European origin. So again, that's visual. They're looking at, okay, later on that got changed to one of the grandparents, and then the other clause, or the other instruction given for the recruitment officers was if that person has grown up or worked with and lived amongst white people, Europeans, they were allowed to enlist.
Could I just ask, Australian Indigenous weren't considered British citizens, they were considered Indigenous. Were the Maori considered British or Indigenous New Zealand?
Indigenous New Zealand, but that Treaty Waitangi, it had those conditions, those specific conditions in there that they could serve in the British Commonwealth War.
They weren't recognised as British subjects?
No. So, because there's so much sort of uncertainty around, like not all of us look the same. In case you, I guess you've probably worked that out. My grandmother was born with blue eyes, and on that, she's the one who had the ID card up there before. So it really came down to that first observation by the recruitment officer whether they made it through. Aboriginal people served in pretty well most of the units and battalions in the First World War. Quite a lot in the light horse. A lot of them would actually request a preference for the light horse when they joined up. My great uncle, he requested the light horse, got assigned to the 5th Light Horse over here. By the time he got to Egypt, they had so many losses on the Western Front, they decided he'd make a good infantryman, so he ended up on the Western Front. This article here is from the Reveille, 1933, where they started identifying some of the Aboriginal soldiers, particularly from soldiers who fought with them, were wanting them to be recognised and acknowledged. 28 in the 11th Light Horse, the 20th Reinforcement, all but 4 of them were Aboriginal. And pretty well all of those Aboriginal blokes were from Queensland. There's a couple from Western New South Wales. As I said, they had a preference for the light horse because they were drovers, they were stockmen, they were boundary riders, so they were good with horses, and so that's what they needed. There was also quite a few in the remounts. They basically broke in the horses and did all that. We've got I don't know if we've got the photos in your
We've got
display?
a good blog on there, the remounts, where we've had a non-Indigenous serviceman's photo album with photos of these Indigenous servicemen. It was a sports day and they were buck jumping the horses in Egypt. It was a competition keeping the men busy.
Yeah, Banjo Patterson even joined in.
He was in the veterinary corps with them. It's just a fabulous sort of link back to this 20th reinforcements.
Yeah,
You wouldn't
and
imagine them.
Yeah, and so that would be the entertainment for the troops that were on their rec leave from the Western Front and wherever else. And there's these amazing photos. I mean, I don't know how to ride a horse to save my life, but these blokes, the horse is literally vertical off the ground. He's holding on one hand, hat in the other, and he's waving to the camera because the camera's it's just a sort of a setup on a normal tripod there, and it's not just one photo. There's about a half a dozen photos of these horses literally vertical, and not just there was Aboriginal blokes, but there were a lot of non-Aboriginal blokes who were good horsemen as well. A lot of buck jump shows were around in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They were the sorts of ones they were using for the remounts. Now I'll just push on a little bit. I better keep track of time here. Sorry, Mark. Very famous photo here that's in our collection. We've got two men from the 11th Light Horse, Jim Lynn Woodcock and John Geary, and very stern-looking Anglican Church of England minister in the background. People know Brisbane, Pancake Manor. That's on the steps of the now Pancake Manor. These two blokes were in the 11th Light Horse, good friends from up at Bundaberg.
The lady on the left in the front with glasses, that's my great-grandmother.
Which one's that? Is that Alice?
Daisy.
Daisy? Yep. And this one's Alice Bond, yeah.
Is that Alice Bond?
Bond? I think. I'll have to check my notes.
1917, that actually should be Terry Roberts, that's her sister.
Oh, the bridesmaid?
No, the lady on the right. In 1917 was 1921. Alice Bond married.
Oh, yep. Sorry, yeah. Yep. I'm just trying to read my notes here. The part underneath is then yeah. So sorry, it is Daisy.
And it's Geary, isn't it?
And John Geary.
And Tilly Geary at the archives is his great-granddaughter,
Yeah,
great-great-granddaughter,
yeah.
which is really lovely.
So they get married 1917. 1 month later, they're off to Sydney and then off to Egypt and Palestine with the 11th Light Horse. The 11th Light Horse were affectionately known as the Black Watch or the Queensland Black Watch sometimes. So here's the 20th reinforcement. Most of those blokes, Aboriginal blokes. You'll see Baramba Settlement, so that's a former name for Cherbourg. You'll recognise some properties. So here's a couple from Mitchell. Oondaree Station out at Winton, Cowrie Station at Charleville, Winton, Mitchell, and so on. Langlow Crossing at Charleville. So a lot of these blokes had lived and worked around horses, and so that's why they were very much in demand for the light horse. Now, after the war, some Aboriginals managed to get an exemption from the Protection Act. The most popular belief was that Aboriginal people didn't get any soldier settlement. We found one in New South Wales. There's a couple up here in Queensland. There's another bloke who had, or two other blokes who had land settlement, but probably not under the soldier settlement. They were under, one was under the Prickly Pear settlement scheme out at Chinchilla, out that way. Generally no recognition from the RSL, that came in later, and for those blokes on the mission it was returning back to that life of oppression and those strict controls. Some of them did get a welcome home. I mentioned my great uncle, Charles Turner Bird. September 1919, this newspaper article, there's a couple of them on Trove, which is a great resource, and Marg will go through some of that shortly. So Charlie Bird and George Bennett came back from the First World War to Yarrabah, which is also known as Old Toomilla Mission. There was a third bloke, Jack Stacey, who the three of them enlisted. Jack unfortunately got malaria in Egypt, and he came back at the start of 1919. And then it goes through, it's got this great, I was quite amazed by this because Jacob Armstrong is my grandfather's brother. King Bungo the official government representative, he's signed most of the marriage certificates and death certificates. So he's signed my grandparents' marriage certificate, their death certificates and so on. And so they gave rendition of native songs, and there's a bit of a translation that I've done for that. Basically, there's one about this young man coming home and making a clean sweep of his campsite. So basically, this new beginning after the war. Grace Waters, you might have heard of her son, Lenny Waters, the Aboriginal pilot from Nindi Gully, St George, and so on. So my great uncle and Lenny's grandfather, George, went off to war together. And so Grace sang the God Save the King. What it doesn't mention, it's another untold story. There's a lot of untold stories with Aboriginal soldiers. The start of 1919, the Spanish flu came back to Australia as well. So by September, Yarrabah had 110 Aboriginal people. At the start of the start of 1919, they had 110 Aboriginal people living there. 64 died from the Spanish flu, including my grandfather and his brother and his nephew, all on consecutive days. I did a blog post on the deaths for Aboriginal communities because they were so enclosed. That's why places like Yarrabah, Taroom, Cherbourg, they all suffered heavy losses. It's a story that wasn't, and probably still isn't well known. So there's all those sort of hidden histories, and so sometimes you can find them going through Trove and other sources. But things did improve for Charlie. He got some mustard gas on the Western Front, like a lot of the blokes. He got his exemption, and he got a war gratuity. Again, that's sort of another popular belief that the Aboriginal people didn't get soldier settlement, they didn't get the war gratuity and so on. A lot of them did with the war gratuity. There's quite a few out at Mitchell where the families later on applied for it. So Charlie, he decided he'd had enough of sharing, and especially with the gas and his lungs and that, it wasn't really the best of job choices for him. So with his war gratuity, he's invested in a truck and he's doing this carrying business. The Madanga Bridge, for those people that know Mungandai and out that way, that's the crossing between Queensland and New South Wales. Charlie got the honour of being the first vehicle across the new bridge. So some of them did get a good welcome home. And we like to find those stories as well, because there were a lot of good things happening. There were a lot of good people out there, even though the lives of many Aboriginal people wasn't all a bed of roses. We've got good supporters like this bloke here. 1932, the RSL Northern branch in Cairns were having at their annual general meeting, one of the discussions or topics for discussion was whether the children of Aboriginal soldiers should be allowed to go to school. This bloke here, and you can read what he's had to say. There's a the full article is it's a letter to the editor, and he's come out in support of them, and he said they've died just as honourably as any white person. How dare the RSL think they have the right to deny their children the right to school? So there's a lot of support that was starting to happen, and I'll just finish with this last one or two slides and I'll hand over to Marg before my voice goes completely. I've got a bit of a cold happening, sorry. 1915, another great source for information is this Queensland Government Census, because all those unreliable Aboriginal people out there, they wanted to find out who they were, where they were, what they were doing, if they had any property, how much they had in the bank, all those important things that government need to know. So we've got, there's a young bloke up here, half-caste Willie Cummings. He's working out of Kimbuya. He's a general useful. I'm not too sure what that is. And he's licensed out to Mr. William Clark, who's the property owner. And he gets paid 6 shillings a week, which is pretty good for the time, I guess. Here's my other grandfather, or great-grandfather, Jimmy Armstrong. That's my great-grandmother's second husband, my great-grandfather's brother, my great-uncle, and my grandfather on my, great-grandfather on my mother's side, and my great-uncle, and then he's a cousin as well. So all that information there, and it tells you what they're doing, how much they're earning, and then later on, over the page, I haven't got the part. Over the page it actually had the how much property they had. So for my great-grandfather there, he had a saddle and a horse and a buggy, so that was equated to £15 value. But William Cummings was the one I was particularly interested in there, as well as all the other family members. He's enlisted, and he's had to make a statement, a stat dec, to say, I am anxious to enlist in the Australian Imperial Forces. My age is 19 years. My father was a white man born in Queensland and my mother was a half-caste born in Queensland. Both my parents are deceased. I have lived all my life with white people. I am not of German, Austrian, Turkish or Bulgarian descent. Just to make it perfectly clear that he's a good guy to enlist. And fortunately they did accept him. And then we did find, I think Marg has done a blog on Willie Cummings. He looks like, you'll see a lot of these photos, they look like they're deers caught in the, rabbits caught in the headlights. And whether it's that daunting moment where it really hits them what they're really going off to do. So he's been photographed, like a lot of these blokes here, and we've been able to tell their stories through that. And then sometimes you'll find other bits and pieces of information tucked away. So Willie Cummings, district recruiting. So here's he was working at Kimbuya, now he's ended up at Maryborough working on property up there because he's had to return back to the mission to enlist. And so most of the regional newspapers would have a list of the district recruits and say what they were doing. Another great source we have, the Centre for Indigenous Family History Studies on the web. Paul Mackett, for those people who may have heard of Paul Mackett, he does a lot of genealogy, Aboriginal genealogy. He also has indexed quite a lot of the government records. So from that we were able to glean a little bit more about Willie's life before and after the war. So 1913, Willie and Henry Muddigan, they're working on property, they were living on a property out of Boona, and that's where they grew up. They've been moved to Barambah 1913. Then there's also a marriage, so he married Florrie Don 1920 at Barambah after he came back from the war. So there's these other sources of information that add to the picture. Sometimes they do appear on the more official records like birth, deaths, marriages. So this is sometimes many birth, deaths, marriages weren't officially registered. Willie's was. And I'll stop there and I'll hand over to Marg because she'll take you through how do we discover these soldiers? What sort of materials here at the State Library? What are the other sources and that? Because it is like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle trying to put all these pieces together and hopefully they match and it ends up being the right picture at the end. But any questions about any of that before
I've got a question.
Oh.
Where did you get that Queensland Census information from? You know, you got that.
Oh yes, sorry, that Queensland Census, State Archives have digitised quite a lot of material. So there's online at the Queensland State Archives site, you can actually do a search on people's names and so on. You can search by location. So every protector or representative, so usually the police sergeant at that, so Gundawindi Police District. So for my, a lot of my ancestors, they came under the Gundawindi Protectorate or Police District, and so you can search by the surname, or you can just go straight to the if you know where they were at that particular time. Basically, it's a census of every Aboriginal person in Queensland 1915. It's quite a huge download. I've downloaded on my computer because I keep at work here, because it's a great way to cross-reference, because especially when you've got, I'm just looking for a name here, if you're looking up a W. Brown, who enlisted as so-and-so. Brown is a fairly common name for Aboriginal as well as non-Aboriginal people. So by cross-referencing it with, again, like I said before, those three sort of points of reference where I'll check on the Mackett site to see if there's any family information there. I'll use the Tyndale records as well, even though it came along in 1930. Sometimes it'll have, if they've gone back to a property, or if they're, from a property back to the mission, that's one way of tracking them down. If there's anything on the Paul Mackett website to cross-reference as well. Also, even just searching in Trove. Sometimes, the last couple of soldiers I've found here have been when I've been looking for something else on Trove, or somebody else on Trove, and with using Trove, it means typing in something like half-caste recruit or Abo recruit. You have to sort of try and think back to, well, what was the most likely terminology they were using, and.
Indigenous.
No, there's no such thing as Indigenous back then, and they didn't always have Aboriginal. They sometimes have native recruit or native volunteer. So all those different variations on those to try and track down that elusive piece of information that confirms their Aboriginality.
Do you think that they use the term native?
Sometimes, but not often. No, generally it was just Abo or half-caste, usually. And so you have to search up half-caste, quarter-caste and so on, or full-blood volunteer and so on. Because there's so many blokes who've gone off to volunteer. They've got this great article about, Aboriginal tracker so-and-so has gone off to has volunteered for law, but we can't find any records. So whether he's got knocked back at the recruitment or we don't know, yeah. And then there's... I'll just finish up with one sad story. There's Billy Esdale was an Aboriginal tracker. He was, for a lot of the time, believed to be the first Aboriginal casualty on the Western Front. Unfortunately, he wasn't. That bloke he was on the first slide there, Archie Marshall. He was from Boland originally, out west, out past St George, in between St George and Cunnamulla. He was working on a property outside of Charleville, and Billy Esdale was brought into action because Archie got a bit bored, and he put some rocks on the train track to try and derail the Sunlander on the way out there. And so Billy Esdale, the Aboriginal tracker at Charleville, he's tracked him down, and they sent him to Cherbourg, and then Archie's gone off to enlist in the war. Shortly after, Billy Esdale enlisted in the war as well. Archie died 24th April 1917. 1 month later to the day, Billy Esdale died. Billy, he was unfortunate that most of the blokes out west were like me, tall and strapping, and he was a bit taller than me actually. He was about 6'3", 6'4". The trenches weren't always that accommodating for tall people, and a sniper unfortunately saw the top of his head through a gap in the bags, and Billy died. And so he was often seen as the first sort of known soldier that died in the war, but there's the other one before him. Then we've also got a blog on Maitland Madge, one of the first Aboriginal blokes to receive a military medal or any medal in the war. But as it turns out, there was another bloke who got his medal that morning, and Maitland got his in the afternoon. But there's those sort of stories that we're slowly uncovering, and I'll hand over to Marg so she can tell you how we uncover.
Can I just get Charlie's last name again, please? That gentleman's last name from Bolon?
Archibald Marshall. So his mum was Bella Kirk, who has connections down here to the Kirk family in Brisbane, in Cherbourg. Because that's the thing. There's so many family connections that you keep finding. I did because I'm on Facebook and family history and all that. One particular weekend, there was a bit of family discussion on the Gamilaroi family history about Aboriginal soldiers and that, and I put a couple of links to blog posts and all that. And I thought, I wonder how many Aboriginal blokes from Gamilaroi country enlisted. Found 184. 14 of those are in my family tree. Some of them through marriage and that. And so it's just amazing, all these connections. So one time Marg was asking about, there's so-and-so and so-and-so, but I can't work out. Yeah, that's my great uncle's so-and-so, yeah. So
Des is related to a lot of people.
Yeah, and so there's all these connections that turn up. We've got a new admin, Tia. I just happened to be doing some work on the soldiers and that when she came around to introduce herself and all that, and I said, as well as the language, I work on the Aboriginal soldiers, and she said, you haven't come across the name McDonald? And I said, Niney McDonald from St George, and she said, yeah, that's my great grandfather. I said, yeah, we just finished the story on him, and I didn't even realise he ended up in Ipswich and Wulkuraka, and that's where we moved into family moved into from out west, and that we moved to Ipswich at Wulkuraka near the part of the Housing Commission there. And I grew up with Niney's grandson, but I didn't really make the connection until Tia had pointed it out, yeah.
But we don't have a photo of him.
And we can't work out why was he called Niney. It was a nickname of some sort. But there's all those sort of quirky things that we're still finding out. We thought, maybe 9 fingers. I knew a bloke up at Lockhart River when I taught up there, and he was 8, and because he only had 8 fingers. Yeah, so I was wondering if that was the case, or whether it was something, a nickname for something else, whether he was a Lionel or something. I did see a formal name somewhere.
Urban family myth.
Yeah. And
that's kind of where we are with telling these stories. I'll just sort of segue over to here. Using the blogs, I always try and put at the bottom of each page everywhere I've been. So if you're looking for inspiration of somewhere to go, I always put, particularly if I can't remember, of course, where I've been. And I found items on Trove or something like that. There'll always be a trail, and so families can often, they will contact us and say, look, this is what we've been doing. Have you got any more information? Usually no, because it's so scarce. So what we did, we got Philippa's book. Philippa has detailed everyone that they think is Indigenous who volunteered, didn't necessarily go overseas but volunteered, and then we put the Queensland versions into a spreadsheet, and we've been working through it. And like every spreadsheet, when you start at A, the ones at the end get missed. So I'm going to start with someone we haven't done today, and his name is Mr. Yao, or Yu. It's spelled Y-E-O. And I've only just had a quick look at his record, but I thought it might be of greater value for me to go through some of the places I go to see if I can create a bit of a story of him, a footprint, so that if there's any family members who are looking for William Henry Yeo, he's probably Bill, we might find a bit about him. So all I've really got is that his service number, and that he was 25, and he enlisted in Brisbane. So, but that's okay. We can do with that. So what I do is I get up my little toolbox of things, and I put that on that piece of paper that's in front of you, and it's on your USB, and I start to make a little profile just start to write down some poignant things about. So if he was 25 and he enlisted when? Okay, so we have to go to the National Archives. And it's a very good database. You can just put keywords in. So I'm going to put in Yo and 315-3516. And I like to go here versus discovering ANZACs because I find it's quicker and you'll often pop up other records. So if there's a court-martial record or a repatriation record, it will appear in a list, but there's only one for him. And here's his record. And I'm just going to paste that back into my browser so that I don't lose it because they time out. So I'm just going to keep talking at you so that you can absorb this, or you probably already all know all this stuff. But the way I get a view of the man is to just quickly look through this service record. And I'll talk while I'm reading it. So we can see that Mr. Yao, or Yo, enlisted here in May 15.
That depot stamp, you'll see quite a lot on the Aboriginal soldiers.
And sideways it says discharged, certificate and something, and form 9 issued, blah, blah, blah. So he didn't get very far. But down the bottom, this is always very interesting. These forms aren't filled out by the recruits. They're filled out by the recruiting officers. This is his signature here. Now sometimes you can verify other things that you see his signature on. But it also said that his next of kin is Harriet. So this is really important when we're trying to verify, is this person Aboriginal? And she's at Reedsvale, New South Wales.
Yeah, some of those next of kin for the Aboriginal blokes, they might have the chief protector or the superintendent at the mission.
Or a friend.
Yeah, sometimes just a friend, yeah. So you have to sort of evaluate take in all that information, as Mark said, and then evaluate and check and recheck
It's
as you
not
go
always
on.
going to be valid. So you just have to make some notes, and when it starts making no sense, you think, okay, I'm on the wrong track. But here we have, this is a really good teller. He's dark, he's brown, he's black. Sometimes I do these and it says fair, blue, fair, and I go, no, that's not him. But the record number is what I've been given. So, and as Des says, you can't always tell. People are half caste or quarter caste or whatever, but they're still rejected or not. They're still considered Indigenous. And so we tell those stories anyway, but it has to be more corroborative evidence other than saying that they were dark, brown and black.
Yeah, so fortunately with
But here
William
we have,
here, he's,
ta-da!
yeah.
Very rare. But someone has noticed that, and I don't know what the source of the information is. This is a new person to the list. So it's great to be able to just work through this and see if we can make a little story of him by, say, the end of the week. I should be able to get a story of him, and we don't have a photo. So I'll have to take a snip of his record, but at least his story gets told. So I'm just going to flip through and keep going to see if I can gather some more information about him, because there's another enlistment form, and it's a different date. It's the 29th of October 14. So he's had a previous go. So that's interesting. He's very keen to enlist. It's very early in the piece.
And again, that's quite common for the Aboriginal soldiers. There's one bloke, Combo from Dalby, couldn't get in at Dalby, walked all the way down to Dubbo, tried again, got knocked back at Dubbo, kept walking, got to Albury before he was finally accepted. So that shows you how much determination these blokes had to go and fight for the country.
So again, in the nice red pen, not likely to become an efficient soldier, which is their speak for his Aboriginal.
Yeah, generally, or they've played up in the training or something.
They went missing. Or
that's a good clue for Aboriginal soldiers straight off.
He's still got his mum there, He's got Mrs. H. Yao. Now, in the olden days, including when my parents were alive, I was called Mrs. H. Powell. That's my husband's name. But the Aboriginal people never referred to their married partners like that. It was always the woman's name. So we can pretty well sure that Mum is Harriet and that she's at Rage Flat. It's still New South Wales. But for some reason, he's in Queensland, working perhaps. We might get beaten with slow internet here, so no, it's coming back. I usually try and do this at home when it's quiet and people aren't downloading things. But he's at Enoggera. He's where all the guys are. But he's not going to get very far at all by the looks of it. But there are 78 pages in this record, and often there's about 12. So it's got some detail. So that's just a repeat. They didn't use carbon, they made 2 copies. And the National Archives, they copy front and back. Even if it's blank, they copy front and back. So you often get duplicate information, but that's just the way it is. That was their job, is to keep everything. And good on them that they did, and that their mission in this period has been to make sure that all the First World War I records are digitised, but are freely available. That's not the case across the world. I'm just scrolling down, just running my eyes over, saying, okay, this is still the same one. In England, you pay per page. The repatriation records, which come for soldiers who returned and perhaps needed to be hospitalised or to have their false leg replaced or any medical things that came under the Repatriation Commission, the records are there. They are being digitised, but they started with the Gallipoli veterans first. So here we've got another one. So he's gone back to New South Wales, and in 1917, he's had another go. He's very keen. I love it. So Mum's still in Reed's flat by, is it Burrawa? And then there's a little note saying, war medals to widowed mother. So that tells me that he didn't come home. All right. So now I'm going to cheat and I'm going to read the last page of the book and go to page 78, which is on all of the records. It will have all the stamps of when they've issued medals and the plaques and scrolls to the next of kin. And so you can see here, when they started to produce them in the 20s, that they went direct to Mum. Mrs. H, care of. So I'm going to go backwards now. And see, there's the other stamps. So this first one here, if you served in 1415, you would get that. But it says NE, which is not eligible. Not that he was bad, he just wasn't there. And these are the other standard Victory Medal and the British War Medal that were issued. And here are all their advices that they officially would have sent. So here he is. So he started this in 14. He's tried and he's got in 17, and there he's died. And interestingly, his things are sent back on the Baramba. I always like, that's another funny little link. This is a pamphlet that they sent to most families on the graves. The serial numbers on those stamps, there is some form of record held by archives on who those medals were issued to, but they were all issued with their names imprinted on the edges. Okay, so we've established that he has died in 1918. 1918. Yeah, thank you. Someone's got a brain. What I'm looking for now, you will often find wonderful pieces of correspondence to and fro, parents looking for death certificates so they could get insurance or indication that they were eligible for pensions. But she would have because she was a widow. And this is just a little snippet. The Graves Commission, as they were in those days, put out booklets, and it was information on everyone who served and died. And this is exactly what is in any publication, and it tells us who Dad was. So it was William Henry, so he's named after Dad. So I bet he was called either Henry or Bill, because they usually didn't go by Dad's name. William Henry. So you can see I'm just building up a little story, and again, born at Frogmore. Lots of duplicates. I'm just going to go back there. That's when he got vaccinated. Okay. It was very important. They obviously had to keep all of those kind of records. And he just described himself as a labourer. He was 5'9.5". He weighed 12 stone. I can't remember whether that was big or small. It's pretty normal, wasn't it? Chest was 41. Because there were all these limits on what people could. They couldn't be underweight or under physiqued. That's a really bad word, but that's my word for today. More. And now what I'm looking for is, well, that's interesting. So in 1919, the War Graves Commission were given permission to go back to all the battlefields and to gather those men who had died in the field, just like on Gallipoli, and to rebury them into more central graves. I think Russell Crowe did a movie not so long ago about the Water Divine. It's a really lovely story, and it is based on a lot of this. And they would write to the families and tell them that don't be, worried. But it meant that the men could be properly commemorated, and that there were a lot of farmers, particularly in France, who did not want single plots on their properties. So that's what happened. So she's writing to him. So obviously Harriet was quite literate. She was writing in 1921 to the officer in charge of base records, probably still Mr. Lean, Major Lean. So lots of receipts. She's received the memorial plaque. The memorial plaque is what we commonly call the dead man's penny. It's a brass plaque emblazoned with their name and symbolic statues on it, but it was sent to all of the next of kin. Very collectible things these days. You find them on eBay all the time, but they belong with the families. So here is the notification of exhumation of him, and that he's going to Perron in the Western Front. So we've already got quite a lot to talk about. We know where he was born in, I want to go and say Frogmore, but that's not quite right, is it? It is, isn't it? Frogmore. We know who Mum and Dad were, so that's a nice footprint. And we know when he was born. So here you'll often find a typed version, which is much easier than reading the handwritten version, but I'd really like to go through some of his movements. So here he is. He's left Sydney early in 17, but already on the ship's hospital he's been sick. That doesn't say why. Could be mumps, could be VD. He's got to Devonport, got off. He's at Herdcote, and already he's not obeying orders, and he's been given field punishment number 2, which is confined to barracks, which is fine. The Australians' offence punishments were not harsh. The British were. A lot of them were conscripted. The Australians were volunteers, and they didn't really feel that they had the right to punish them so hard, volunteering to serve in a war. Even when they were AWOL, they were usually fined and confined. I'm just whipping back again. See, there's a letter that's been returned. So she's moved from Reed's Flat. And that's one of the difficulties there's often been said to me, oh, that they never got their medals. Well, often they didn't have a fixed address. So it was very difficult for people in, say, Melbourne to find someone who is working as a stockman on many properties, either with an exemption certificate or not. So finding the rightful owners were pretty hard. So here is the cursive script that you sometimes have to wade through, and it's exactly the same, but some nice person has typed it out, but sometimes you'll get a little bit more information. So Herdkit is spelt out, so you know that's the training camp. Sometimes I'd like to know what neglecting to obey GO para bounds means, but I think it's general order paragraph, something about being out of bounds. But then we start to see that he's got bronchitis when he's in France. So you can see the movements and the dates, so you can build up a little timeline. So he's gone to Havre, which was where their training camp was. He's got bronchitis at Harfleur. He's gone back to hospital. He's gone to the unit again in Havre. He's gotten back to hospital. It was a tough, 1917 was one of their worst winters for many, many decades. So someone who came from Queensland or New South Wales would have very little experience of that kind of weather. But he got to go to Paris on leave. Then he came back, not for very long, and so he rejoined the unit. On the 25th of the 8th, on the 1st of the 9th, he was killed in action. So if we want to find out where his battalion was, did anybody note what his battalion was? 54th? Sounds, yes. Is it? Oh, beautiful. You can go quickly, I'm trying not to go over time for you, to the Australian War Memorial Unit Diaries. These are either really good or really boring, depending on the person who is in charge of writing them. It's not in alphabetical order, but the infantry is number 23. And if we go down to the 54th, so the bigger the number on the battalion, the later in the war. The 54th. And on the 1st of September, 1918, it's sometimes really good to place them, you know, what was going on. It's 36 pages, that's quite a good diary. I'm just going to whip through, on that left-hand column is the date. So I'm looking for, oh yes, it's the first. Catch up, Marg. And then we can make it bigger. So you can, on the left-hand side, as it's been cut off by the scanner, is the place where they are, and it'll be an exact narrative of what they were doing at the time. And sometimes at the end of that day, you'll see how many casualties. Sometimes they'll name who was killed. It's just a fabulous piece of resource, which the wonderful Charles Bean encourage them. So they're at Clary. That's Clery. Let's just do what all good researchers do. Find out where it is. He set it almost like a competition, and you know what soldiers are like. Anything is great if it's a competition, to see who would write the best diaries to be lodged with this new Australian War Museum, as it was called in the time. So it's on the Somme, Clery sur Somme. So it's obviously on the part of the river. Okay, so that is where you can start to write your story about what he was doing, what was happening with the battalion on that day. They were storming the trenches or whatever. So Mr. Yao was there. Obviously there was a major battle because this goes on for pages and pages. Okay, so if we want to find a bit more about him, the other place is again the Australian War Memorial, whose new website is challenging. So we'll just put in Yao, and the metadata behind their website is not friendly. But we do have one entry for him, which is great. So let's see. We have visited them recently, and they are trying very hard with this overwhelming amount of inquiry that they have to amalgamate a lot of the records on this website so that it's a one-stop shop. But that hasn't happened yet. So I really like to see the embarkation roll. It tells me who else was on that ship with him. So you can make it bigger. Yep. And don't tell anybody, but this is my secret way of seeing, because this is just the page where his name appears. If you just change that figure at the top to go to the previous page, there's the rest of the guys. So I'll just go back to the page that they supplied, and it's their page is, ends in 747. Well, I've just changed it to 746 to see if the wonderful scanning team have continued their naming conventions. Being someone who works in a library, you do those sort of things.
So that's how we're able to find all those Aboriginal blokes in that 20th reinforcement for the light horse. Just going through the names.
Yeah. So when we first started digitising the soldier portraits in 14-15, the pages came out like that. And now they're all individually scanned, or like that. But it's very hard to kind of like, well, if he was Sid Roberts, I wonder if he was on the same ship as Edward Smith. And going through the embarkation roll for one of them, you can find many. There's another little, I'm just going to quickly whip off that page now. This is my very favourite go-to database. It's by the Australian Defence Force Academy, and they've obviously got a data set from the National Archives on World War I soldiers. It's only World War I, and it's a very quick search. You can just restrict it to the surname like I'm doing. You can put in Queensland if you think you're going to be looking for John Smith. Ta-da. Not everybody is here. Those who just got to the depot won't probably be on here. But it quickly says something we didn't know, that they've called her Louisa. It's another soldier, isn't it? Oh, okay, it's Walter Henry. I've got William Henry. Okay, go back. Let's not restrict it to Queensland because he was New South Wales, wasn't he? But then, there's more than one Yao in the war. William Henry, there we go. Borough, New South Wales. So you can see it's an extract, but it is really great for quick research. If you're looking to just put something together quickly, just go to this Add for database. It's really handy, really handy. Now I'm just going to go back one screen. It's on the right-hand side to William Henry's name, second from the bottom, is those who went with him. Ta-da! It is a bit of a dun-dun because sometimes you just spend your whole day looking for other names. We've got transcribers transcribing letters for us at the moment, and the soldiers always mention their mates, and you want to find out who they were. Did they go to school with them? This is one way of doing that. But again, this database is from when they enlisted, where they were assigned. When they went overseas, often they were assigned somewhere else. So it's a starting point. And it gives all the guys' names. You think, oh, it's Kraft. That's what the name is. So I always use this. Okay, where were we? Embarkation roll. So that's my little secret weapon.
Yeah, because I just noticed another Aboriginal soldier whilst you're on that page there. Co, because sometimes you'll pick the surname and then you can match it up with the place. So Wellington, so he's from the mission down there.
Is he on the list?
Yeah. I just double checked there because I knew some of the Co family, and I knew that they were associated with Wellington.
Can you see why having Des in the team is just so invaluable? My heritage is not Indigenous in any way. Scottish. And I don't come from Queensland, so I'm really up against it. I don't even know the place names, but I'm learning. And what we can do with Des's community knowledge is put it together and confirm it all. And unfortunately, sometimes things that have gone into the first editions of these kind of publications have been anecdotal, and we've not been able to verify them. So that's why we go to all of this trouble to find out if the word Aboriginal or half-caste appears somewhere, or if not, use Paul Mackett's site to see if they're mentioned just somewhere else. Sometimes it's a Trove article to say this Aboriginal horse rider enlisted. That's enough. So we can just go on with our story.
Because there's one photograph of floods in Deniliquin, and he's ex-soldier so-and-so with his family rowing across the river at Deniliquin. We didn't have him on the list anywhere, or didn't have him in Philippa's book, and then we just found that looking up something else. Yeah.
So we collaborate very heavily with Philippa Scarlett and her amazing researcher Christine Kramer, who are in Canberra, particularly if we've got a problem, if we really can't verify someone or we've had an inquiry we can't answer. They're terrific. And they'll be coming up on the 22nd of June. There's going to be a workshop similar to this, but probably not quite as Des and me centric. And we're inviting some very interesting people to come and talk to us about the whole, like Des's story, about the whole story around their enlistment and why they did come, etc. Okay, so we're back at the War Memorial, and here is my other favourite go-to place. But because he's died, he will be listed on the Roll of Honour. And of course he'll have a poppy spot at the War Memorial, and it will tell you when his name is going to be projected on the wall up there. So he'll be commemorated, which is lovely for families. If you can I always put that link in the bottom of the story because someone might go to Canberra or not. I've been several times now, and it's such a moving thing. But in the middle here is another very secret thing, this Roll of Honour circular. A piece of a feedback form was sent to every family who lost a relative, and they were asked to fill it in. And sometimes you can find out all sorts of stuff. So here it is. So it's been filled in by his mum, and it tells you where he went to school, where he lived, and sometimes it actually tells you his real date of birth. So if you've ever seen an enlistment form where they've stated that he's 18 and 1 month, take that as a stretch of the imagination, because that's what every recruiting officer would tell them if they looked a bit young, and you didn't have to supply a birth certificate, and they really didn't look too young. But often the mother will say, or the parents will say, or, you know, when you're looking at not Indigenous people's records, it will say where they went to school, that they went to cadets, and it gives you another great big link to their whole story. And down the bottom on the 10th question is information that sometimes is filled in because you won't realise that they had a brother or two that also served, and they'll fill that in too. So this is not an obvious piece of information, but it's super, super invaluable.
Because there's so many Aboriginal families where brothers have enlisted. I did a blog post on that because he just kept finding whole groups, and there's this one family from down New South, five of the brothers enlisted, only 2 came back.
So dry as it is, the homework is worth doing to fill this picture up. So at least he had mum to take his medals. I'm assuming that she passed it on to other family members. I don't know if he had siblings or not, but we can do other things to find out, and one of them is to go to Ancestry. So I have my own account because I'm doing this all of the time, and Des has his own account. But if you're working in the library here, there's a library version, which is free, and most libraries, if you go to them, do have a version of Ancestry for you to look at. And because I'm logged in, if you ever see Max the Kelpie, that's me. I'm everywhere. Nobody seemed to have that name when I sign in, so it's really good. And I've made a hell of a lot of family trees when I'm researching soldiers, so that I don't have to keep writing it all down. I can gather it together, and then what Ancestry does, because they own a lot of databases, when you do a query, it searches in a federated way across all of those databases and gathers you information like their birth date, like their death date, or their marriage, regardless of what state they're in, because it will find them if the information is accurate enough. Where am I going? Let's go to Frank Woods' family tree. Oh, I can't remember who Frank was, but anyway. Oh, it's the Cubby family. Okay, and the little green leaf tells us that there's some information. No one in family tree. Yeah. It's all married. Everybody knows everybody from Gundwitty. So you can do this without creating your tree, but you can gather death information. So from Frank Woods, we can see that his mother was Ida and his father was William. You can look up. I really like the electoral rolls, because you can see who they're living with, and if his wife's name is this, or maybe his older brothers. And Aboriginal people live in communities, and if they're on the electoral roll, they're all together.
And then you'll see Charlie Dennison's name on quite a few, because he had 7 wives, had his last child when he was 72, stopped riding a horse when he was 94 because he got thrown off one and broke his pelvis, lived to 110. And so you can see, this bloke Frank Woods, he hasn't even got, he's taken a different name altogether. He's with Ida Cubby, who's one of Charlie's 7 wives. My great-grandmother was one of his wives, and her sister was one of his wives, because back in the old days, if the wife died, if the sister wasn't married, she had to take her place until he found another wife, which he did later on.
So I'm going to go back to what Des mentioned, is the Centre for Indigenous Family History Studies, which isn't a centre, it's a website, which until recently was very easy to search, but it seems to have changed. I think because he's
got so much data on there now, his own search engine was crashing.
But there is a way of searching it. I'll just click on the Queensland section. The New South Wales section, I believe, has changed considerably because there were some complaints about it. But honestly, this has been such a wonderful go-to spot for family information. So once you're in the page, just need to do your Control F, and you can look for Mr. Yao. He won't be here because he's New South Wales, but we could look up Cubby. Oh, sorry, noises. There's all sorts of hidden little Cobbo. There you go. Interestingly, it doesn't highlight really well, but here we are. But you'll get more family information. If you're not Indigenous like me, finding the information I find challenging, but all he's done is simply transcribed data from the archives. He hasn't interpreted it in any way, and that's what we want.
Yeah, and he'll give you the reference or the microfilm that you need to go to, when you go to the archives. You've got the details there. You go see Tilly or one of the team at the archives, and they can bring that microfilm, that document out straight away.
So the one way that he has put on the front page, and which I had to ask Des how it works because it just didn't make sense to me. You put in the command cite : and then you put in his website, and then you put in your search string. So I can put in Myrtle Douglas. So we know that Myrtle, I've looked for Myrtle before, and it should bring you up, as it has in the wonderful search results, that Myrtle Douglas died. So let's find out where he was. Because sometimes you want to find out what people do. Okay, let's spell Myrtle correctly.
Because that's the other thing, the spellings of names will
it's very challenging.
just spin you out. Like, we're looking up law, Krupp from Cherbourg. And you think, well, 3 letters, how could you get that wrong?
It's laws.
It's laws in the, and there we are. And by sheer providence, we had a young historians workshop, these young students coming in and researching, and one of the young ladies there says, we asked her, well, asking her more, what do you want to get out of the 3 days, whatever it is? And she said, I'd really love to find a photo of my grandfather or great grandfather, and only the day before we'd found it, and by sheer luck, because I can't remember what I was looking at. I might have been searching for somebody else's name, and I saw this Laws, Vincent V. Laws came up, and yeah, that was him.
Okay, so my last really great resources trove. Don't underestimate it, just underestimate your ability to put in the right search terms. Because late at night, the glass of wine, I've come across the most amazing things which confirm that this man was in that region, and that unfortunately on the way home from the pub he got knocked over and killed by a car, having served in the Western Front. And yes, the job is very emotionally expensive. You come across these very sad stories, but what we can do is put those stories into our blogs, which are crawled, and people, particularly over things like ANZAC Day weekend or things like that, they will write to us and say, thank God, I didn't know that he served. It's fantastic. My children are going to take those stories away. I've had a lovely conversation with Kane in Foster in Victoria, who was married to one of the men of the boys of Baram. He's related to. And these fellows didn't get to serve, but his grandmother moved to Victoria and married an itinerant fruit picker. So he has a very unusual name, but he now introduces Indigenous stories to his community in Foster, because his great-grandfather was Bertie Beckett, who didn't get to go, but he did put his hand up. I just think it's a wonderful way of making those links. I've even sent him a copy of this book so that he can put it in his local library to annoy them. And you know, he rang the other day to say, thanks for the book, really loved it, and I should let you know that I snuck up and put the Aboriginal flag on the memorial on Anzac Day. Yes.
That's something on the Western Front. There's so many Aboriginal flags on the graves there, including the groups that come through here on the Young Historians workshops and that. I was over there last year, and it's just really amazing to. There's this sea of white headstones, and then you can pick out the Aboriginal flags. That was the catalyst for the Black Diggers play as well. That they happened to come across a ceremony where a school from Adelaide were paying their respects to one of the Rigney brothers over in Belgium, and the director or the writer of the Black Diggers saw that and wondered what was going on, and then then the question, well, how does the soul of an Aboriginal person return to their homeland if they've died so far away? And they were going through this ceremony where they brought some soil from where we grew up at Port Macleay Mission, took it over to Belgium, put that there, refilled it with Belgian soil from the gravesite, and took it back to South Australia.
Isn't that great? Because I had Eric Law from Cherbourg Mission, the man whose ancestor we spelt incorrectly in the catalogue as Laws, approached me about George Aiken, who's buried there, and he's one of these who's commemorated, but he has no grave, because often they were blown to a lot of pieces, or later on the battle came across where they died and they just weren't recoverable. And he said, we want to take country to him. It was a big ask, but I did find pretty much where he was buried by using the unit diaries. We could pinpoint where they were killed, and there's another set of. Let me just show you quickly on the War Memorial.
Sorry, Mark, just looking at the
Yep. Okay.
Oh, yep.
This is very important.
Sorry, as you can see, there's lots of stories, and we just love sharing them. Yeah, because like we said at the start, these stories haven't been told, and they really need to deserve to be told. And,
That's right.
And particularly if the family can pick them up and fill in all those other missing parts of the story.
The Red Cross Wounded and Missing files are usually based on inquiries made by not Indigenous people. So Indigenous people didn't have the literacy skills to make inquiry of the Red Cross bureaus in Queensland, who would forward those inquiries on to England, who would then go and try and find out what happened to the soldier. Basically, the mums wanted to know where their soldier died. And these will often appear when you search for the person on the War Memorial. It'll be in that list of Red Cross Wounded and Missing files. And they made inquiries of fellow soldiers who survived the battles, who might have been recovering in hospital or were on leave in London, and they would record their interviews, and they all went on these Red Cross Wounded and Missing files. And they will say, blokes don't hold back punches. They will say, yes, he was shot in the head and blah, blah, blah. But that's what people wanted to know. And did he get taken out of the trench and taken to a clearance station? Did he die there? So those messages are very powerful, are sitting in these files. So for Mr. Yao, we don't have any of them. Some of the other fellas we do, and I would have, on any of the blogs, if I'd have found them, I'll put them there.
Yeah, and sometimes they'll give you that extra clue to say that he was a very dark man, and give you those sorts of clues. There's one diary we've had digitised. This prisoner of war, young merchant sailor, ended up in a prisoner of war camp in Germany, and he's talking about this Cobar Billy, this Aboriginal soldier who was there. And then we've tracked down who Cobar Billy was, and he's in the book, yeah. Mm-hmm. But here he is talking about because he grew up out west. This young sailor, he was looking forward to getting some bush tucker with Cobar Billy, because that's what he grew up on. Yeah.
Okay, so the end of Mr. Yao's story is that he died, but the Commonwealth War Graves Commission record a lot of information. So I'm just going to put his name in, and remember that he is William Henry, and see what comes up. And there is his record. So if you just click on that arrow there, you'll get a little summary. And yes, you get that. Remember I said that publication had that little bio, but there is the inscription on his grave. So families were given the option of paying to have an inscription written and put onto the gravestones. You don't see a lot of them for Indigenous people, but this one, there is one. And they're absolutely gorgeous pieces of Australian folklore. So if you ever get the opportunity, do look for some of them. Some of them are absolutely made up. They're heartfelt. I heard someone from the War Memorial say that he would love to put together something about these gorgeous thoughts and prayers that have been put forever on their gravestones. There are other things that it tells you where the gravestone is. There's a copy of what was printed and put on the service record there. And just recently I found memorial photograph. Memorial grave photograph. Because I was looking for something else. And volunteers have gone around to all the graves, as you do, and photographed all of that they can, all the gravestones when the internet comes back. And you can order a copy of the grave. It's a picture. It's coming, come on. There are thumbnails on the website to show you that you've actually got to the right person. But again, you can just do, oh, there it is. So we can do, yeah.
Oh, way,
backwards. Yeah. Okay, all right. I have got my glasses on. William, because not everybody gets to go to the Western Front and see. And for some people, it's the best thing, absolutely the best thing. So there were a few William Yaos. I'm looking for, here he is. And particularly these soldiers that we don't have photos of. There really is no excuse that we can't tell their story, just because we can't illustrate it with their face. But sometimes it's, I mean, if I could get a photo, the internet is being a little bit slow, but it will ping up a little thumbnail of it. So if you're teaching your children or doing this for yourself, go to the other end. Always try and, I like to tick all the boxes off and tell the whole story. And if he comes home, maybe see if you can find out what happened to him. And that's hard. That really is hard. Someone today rang and said that they would come and help me tell the rest of their Meredith story. Because the footprints are so shallow for Aboriginal people, Indigenous people. Their records aren't there. Unless they were drunk and got arrested, you usually will not find anything about what happened to them. So, okay, questions? Stunned mullets, I can see that. I'm going to come close to you so that people can hear.
Were all the departures from Sydney Harbour, or were they?
No. Many of them were from here, from Pinkenba. There were a lot of the early contingents left in 1914 from Pinkenba.
So North Queenslanders would have come down to Pinkenba?
Everybody trained in Enoggera. So they would have come down to Enoggera or Lytton camp out at Fort Lytton. There were various camps at Enoggera, so there was Rifle Range Camp, Thompson's Paddock, depending on if you're infantry or light horse. But if they were gathering battalions, then orders would come and they would take a troop train down to Sydney altogether and then depart from there. Sometimes they called into Melbourne and picked up more men, but often there would be Melbourne-Adelaide contingents would go together and then go across to Albany and then across. But often they left from Brisbane. But it's good, I always like to know what the name of the ship is and see if there were other mates together on the same ship. And the 1917 light horse fellas, who many enlisted after May when the restrictions were lifted, all went together. And most of the light horse stayed in Egypt after the end of the war because the civilian population in Egypt rebelled against the British rule. And so the light horse were there, kept as a garrison contingent, and they all came home together on the same boat. So they all spread their germs together, which was really nice, and a lot of them came home and spread the flu. So that's a lot of that entry back into Queensland and New South Wales and Victoria. That's why the epidemic, it was already in Europe, and people here had not had that movement of troops and that percolation of germs on a boat. That's why they all got mumps and measles on board ship. Very often they were admitted to the ship's hospitals with those because they're in confined quarters. Anybody else? No, everybody wants to go home for dinner. Thank you so much for coming and not falling asleep. And I do hope you've got something out of all of that. And please share any stories. Oh, look, it's come up. Isn't that fabulous? You can see it's kind of... But, and the reason why in 1919 and 20, the people here sent photos of the graves. They had people going around taking photos of the graves in 1919 to give to next of kin, and you could order extra copies. It's on many of the records. It's a point of grief. It was a way of saying, this is where my son is, you know. And often lovely crosses had been erected by their fellows, so very sentimental things. So I hope you've got something out of it.